What's up, guys? As you can see here, new 22 KRT edition. Figured I didn't get a chance to really make a video of putting the race bike together over the winter because I didn't have this over the winter. I was waiting on it, but I got it now, so I figured it's a good time. I'm going to be stripping this down, turning it into the race bike, and I wanted to shoot a video of putting all that together. Just the little things that convert the street bike off the showroom floor into the way I race it. Not gonna video stripping this down. I've made a video of that before, or at least of stripping the race bike. So if you want to see that, there'll be a link right here somewhere, wherever I can put it on YouTube. There'll be a link to that teardown process if you want to watch that. But for now, first thing we got to do is take everything off. So we're going to go totally down to bare frame, engine out, swing arm off, forks off, everything's got to go. All we're going to do is get left with bare frame and then start the build up from there. So strip it with some magic. Okay, so new bike down to bare frame, and this is pretty much where we start. First thing I want to do before I mess with anything else, or before I start going back together, is I like to get the engine sort of in place. I'm not going to throw it up in the frame yet, but just under the frame on the jack, ready to lift up. So we'll go ahead and do that. Alright, so now the next thing I'll do is start doing the little things on the frame that will be hard to do once the engine's in. So for starters, a couple bodywork mounts, we'll throw those on. So we're going to stick these on, and these are two that I just made into to accept the Zeus fasteners. This is what the stock ones look like. Nothing crazy, but it's just these little things that make life easier later on. So stock one, I grind the nut off, grind a little bit of this tab off, and then I can slip on a Zeus fastener. And later you'll see that's where the side of the upper is clips in. So we'll get these on the frame here. We'll go on right like that on both sides. Okay, frame mounts are on, or those two brackets are on. Next thing we're going to put on is the rear sets. If we wipe them down a little bit, because I did have rain in Miami, and that always gets things a little extra dirty. So we'll get these wiped down and then slap them on. So a bit of Loctite on the bolts. And we'll get our shifter side on. Sometimes I like to chase these threads with a tap if there's a bunch of Loctite in there, but these actually look pretty good, just some flakes on the outside. And the reason I like to do the rear sets early on is it gives me a more stable point for the jack stands when it's time to throw the engine up in. So once these are in and secured, I've got a nice rigid contact point. I can move the jack stands to the pegs, make the frame a lot easier to sit still when I'm lifting the engine up. Working the brake side now, you'll notice that I still have the whole brake system still attached to the rear set. So the master still on the rear set, and the caliper still connected to the master, all that system still sealed. Normally when I'm doing this, it's at the end of the season, so like late October, early November, and I will totally separate this because brake fluid gets, or all the both front and rear brake systems get totally overhauled over the winter, which I did do this past winter, but I didn't have the new bike over the winter. So I just got the new bike in between rounds, so I'm doing all of this just this weekend. Tore the new bike down on Friday night, Saturday, put it back together, put the street stuff back together with it on Saturday, and now Sunday we're putting the race bike back together. But that's why I left all of this sealed together, because it's not getting the overhaul that it got over winter. It's just coming off for the weekend and going right back on. All right, rear sets are on. So now, like I said, we can move the jack stands back to the pegs here. Actually, I need to leave that off. And that'll give us a little bit more room down in here, and then we can lift the engine. One thing I forgot to mention, once we put the bolts in, even though they're Loctited, still want to hit them with a paint pen, and those ones need to be touched up, just so you can see if they ever loosen up and spin. You've got a marking there. All right, so pegs are on. We're ready to lift the engine up into the frame. One thing you'll notice right now, I still have the exhaust on. Normally, I don't leave the exhaust on when I'm pulling motors, but again, when I'm doing this, it's usually a winter project, so everything's coming apart to be cleaned anyway. This was just a weekend project, so exhaust stayed on, just because I had no other reason to pull it. So I just want to note that I don't always leave that on, and I don't recommend leaving it on when you're pulling motors out. Oh, you know what? Should mention before we start lifting, make sure you run all your collars all the way in. Or I'm not saying you should do that. I'm saying I always run my collars all the way in. And then the one on the engine, I run it all the way in that way. So collars in the frame, I run out. Collar on the engine goes in. Again, I'm not telling you how to do anything. This is not a how-to video. This is a how I do video. Now I'll get all the mounting bolts ready to send once it's lined up. Okay. Now it goes from that side. And we'll send our bottom through. Beautiful. And the top. All the bolts are in, just slid into place and ran in by hand. Now we gotta bust out the service manual. Pretty sure I know the process, but you should always follow the manual because there's a sequence for tightening and getting all the nuts on. Basically, what we'll do is pull the engine this way first by torquing our bolt here, running our collar out that way, running our collar in that way, pushing the whole motor against the fixed side of the frame, and then we go through and start torquing collar lock nuts, and then finally loosen engine bolts and then tighten engine bolts again. But again, break out the service manual, do whatever it says. So we'll do that. Okay, engine's in, and one thing I forgot to mention is I actually, before torquing all those bolts, I take the weight off of the stand. So this was in here, but it wasn't actually supporting anything. After I get all the bolts in, but before I torque stuff down, I drop the stand out so that the weight of the engine is hanging and the frame is being supported by the stands. If you do that every single time, then it'll be the same every time, you know, because theoretically, yeah, the engine should be in the same point every time you mount it. But if I was to leave this supported, then whatever clearances there are, it could be hung ever so slightly. It could be putting little tensions in the frame in different ways. Not that I would ever notice at my riding pace, but it's a possibility, and you might as well do something that's repeatable. And now we are ready to move on. So the next thing I'll do is throw the swing arm in. Okay, so first things first, we're getting the swinger on, and kind of going back to what I was saying before, when I do this over the winter time, the swing arm gets new linkage bearings, the linkage gets all new bearings, but that was all done over the winter. And now, because we're just between 2 rounds, I don't have to do all that. Just a quick wipe down to get the rain marks off the swing arm and any sand and dirt out of the way. We're ready to slide back on. So chain stays on the swing arm. In this case, again, that's one of those things that will get replaced over the winter. Pivot goes through. We've got an adjustment collar on the pivot bolt. So once all that is sent through, okay, and then we'll have a nut that goes on here. Once that's started, we'll torque the pivot in to take up this side-to-side slot. That's what the adjustment collar does. And then we can throw our shock and everything on. So grab a socket and get this in. Just coming in. There's no more. Successfully. Here. Smooth. Okay. Alright, swing arm pivot is torqued, lock nut's torqued, nut on the other side is torqued, and then I like to safety wire the pivot shaft, just because you can never have too much safety wire, and it's not an item that ever really comes undone, except for during teardowns and cleanings or crashes. So I'm going to go ahead and safety wire that, and then I'll silicone the nut on the other side. Okay. That's for the camera. Not very secure. There we go. Okay. Alright, so now we're in. There's that. I'll get a few more twists on this closing now. Okay. Snip. Twist. Pinch. And now I can tuck it. Give it a spin. And tuck it in. There we go. Okay, not the prettiest. It'll work. Just run a bead of silicone around here. Okay. Got our swing arm on. Got our shock all cleaned up. Just a little, nothing crazy, just a little soapy water and toothbrush. We can drop our shiny shock into place. Make sure your sticker's showing for your sponsor, Velocity Calibrations. Oh yeah. Over the winter, I'll send the shock to Eric over there at Velocity. He'll refresh, rebuild, all that kind of good stuff, which is something I used to do by myself on stock shock, but Eric's the specialist. He helps me out tremendously with tuning advice and just help me go faster, and So I'm happy to have him service the stuff as well, because he's a professional. He's got all the tools, and to be honest, I've never taken apart an aftermarket shock like that. So even though I'm a mechanic for a living, I leave the suspension stuff to him, the specialist. So we'll get that put on, and then the lower, get it on the lower end here. All right, and on the bottom side, kind of nice, the Bitubo shock has the nut built in, so we just send the bolt through, and it threads right into the captive nut that's in the clevis there. Get these all torqued down. And then I actually will stick the nut on the other side just for security, but it's really not needed if that's torqued to spec. Send our linkage bolt through up here. Okay, swing arm is all torqued, linkage all torqued. One last thing though before I put it on the rear stand, and that is going to add some shims on top of the shock clevis. So the shock does have adjustable height, but I like to baseline the shock at stock height. It's just easier for Eric to work that way, and also really me for my notes and everything. And then I'll put some shims in here because I know as far as baseline adjustments go, I want to add some shims to raise the rear. And then if I ever am in a point where I need to play with the rear ride height at the track, then I can adjust the length of the shock on the bottom down here. But for baseline, stock length on the shock, and then we just add in our shims here. So we'll do that now, and then we can put it on the stand and probably do the subframe next. Okay, so we're on the rear stand, swing arms on, all that good stuff, ready to throw the subframe on. And when the subframe goes on, then it'll really start to look like a bike again. There's going to be a lot of steps that kind of go with that, because all of the electronics are attached to the subframe, and I'll show you that once I get it on, how I have that all as kind of one big assembly. So subframe, harness, all that good stuff. Get one wire underneath. That's our starter wire. Really just make sure nothing's going to get pinched. Nothing's going to be misrouted. And we'll first install the bolts dry temporarily. Oops. And then once they're all in, once all the bolts are in and the wires and everything's hooked up where they need to be, then I can undo them one by one and come back with some Loctite. So that'll work. Again, I'm going to leave that loose for now. Because we'll come back, once all this is hooked up, I'll come back and Loctite and torque those. But now, I just want to show you, so I've got the front half of the harness just folds down, and I'll run that under there. The rear portion of the harness just comes back to, ECU, which I have on the stock bike, sits more like where my hand is right here, and the plugs face that way. So I basically take the ECU, flip it upside down, upside down and backwards, just to get it closer inboard, and also it's now between this front subframe. This is two pieces, just a little bit slightly better protected. Also, it's just easier to mount that way because I cut off all of this under tray for the bodywork. Battery sits in stock location, lithium battery. Relay box, this rubber housing that the relay box sits in is normally attached to the ECU. So that's all one rubber piece. So I slice the relay portion of the rubber housing off and separate those two. So ECU goes forward, well protected, gets weight centralized. Not that I noticed that difference, but you know, it does. And then relay box stays rubber mounted, loosely rubber mounted and zip tied. Because hey, what is a race bike without zip ties? It's not a real race bike. Power commander. The ECU is flashed by Taylor Motorsports, and there is some tuning changes to the fuel mapping in the ECU, but also he does some tuning through the power commander because it's faster, easier. So like base tune through the ECU, and then if I ever need to do trackside tunes, or if he wants to make little changes, not crazy huge stuff in the ECU, he can do just fueling changes through the power commander. Makes life fast and a little simpler. Let's see what else back here. Obviously no lights, so all lights come off, but connectors are still in place. I don't need them, but I've got them in case I ever did go back to street. What else back here? So starter wire, that's what we saw earlier. That has to go down under the frame, so that'll get hooked up after it gets routed. Other than that, pretty much everything stays visible. So ground wire to the frame here, negative wire from battery post will run through the rubber shroud, bolt to the engine. Show you that, where that'll go. So that'll go down there through these rubber shrouds here. Rear wheel speed sensor comes up through here, gets plugged in there, and then once throttle bodies go on, all of this will be plugged into the throttle bodies. Really nothing too crazy here, nothing different from stock until we get up to here. So front portion of the wiring harness. Try to do this one-handed here. Or here, I'll show this part. So on the stock bike, the wiring harness would come up here and ride in the fairings, underneath the frame, ride in the fairings here. So your relay box will sit there, up to the meter. Your regulator rectifier would sit here, inside the fairings. So normally you can see all this electrical tape. That is not factory, that's what I did. So I sliced the harness open to take this reg rec plug out and run it back down here, because my reg rec sits on the sprocket cover here, and we'll get to that later in the video. But that is one deviation from the stock setup. The stator still plugs into this 3-wire here, so that stays up front. The stator wire comes up through this bracket just like factory, and that'll stay more or less in the factory location, but the reg rec plug will come back to the rear. So this will all sit under here. Now, instead of riding along the fairings like they do on the stock setup, I run them all inside, inbound of the forks, and they'll ride up along the air duct, which is not bolted up yet. And that just makes the body work so much easier to get on and off quickly. And you know, if you need to repair it or straighten something out, change forks, whatever, all of that is just a much easier, cleaner setup because you don't have headlights and everything up in this space, so you've got more room for mounting your relay box or fuse box and all these wires. So we'll get to that whenever I'm getting the air duct cover and everything on, but just wanted to show that now. And yeah, pretty straightforward. So we'll start plugging all this stuff in and carrying on. Alright, so mostly all plugged up until the throttle bodies go on. So 2 TPS connectors, primary and secondary. all injector connectors, map sensors, ETV, and then ignition switch, pair valve doesn't get used, front wheel speed sensor, fan, left hand cluster. Oops, nope, that is for the ignition switch. It's upside down, there we go. Stock quick shift connector, but voltage quick shifter because the ECU is flashed with race tools, which lets me use the ECU to control the quick shift, but just the voltage sensor, so that I can do GP shift, which is how this is. It's not on yet, but that's GP shift orientation. Now we'll throw on the air duct and the meter, and then that'll let us start mounting all this stuff. Okay, that ain't gonna work. So you'll notice this is not the stock air duct. This is a fiberglass unit. Came with the bodywork. Just a little lower profile, gel coated, looks nice. Maybe a little bit stronger too, although I still don't know if either one's gonna break with the right crash, but this one's probably a little bit more durable than stock and lower profile. So nice unit. There. And I don't have a bodywork sponsor or anything, but Taylor Motorsports, who does all the dyno tuning for me, Mike Taylor, he's a dealer for several bodyworks companies. I think Woodcraft, Shark Skins, which are both, or Armor Bodies and Shark Spins, which are both top quality products. So you could hit him up for any of those, and that's where mine came from. So okay, that's on. Run our meter wire up, connect that. Okay, and then again, it's not a race bike if you don't have zip ties, so this stuff's all going to just get zip tied to the neck here, and then up here on the meter. Keeps it out of the way of the bodywork and out of the way of the forks. Okay, I suppose next we'll move on to the regulator rectifier that I had mentioned earlier that I mount on the sprocket covers. So from the factory, there's like a plastic plate. There's usually a plastic plate that sits in here with these 3 bolts or three screws into the plastic. That's plastic threads. So I remove that plate, drill those holes all the way through, and then I just have this stainless triangle piece that my buddy machined out for me, and that holds the bracket perfectly well. So that'll go up in here, and that's why earlier I mentioned that I run this Reg Rec connector backwards from stock position about here in the fairing, run it backwards down to here. So we'll get that thrown on, show the front sprocket. Before I do that, I safety wire that, safety wired oil filter. So all that's about to get covered, so just wanted to show that, and yeah, we'll get this thrown on. Next up is throttle bodies, and then controls. Alright, so top triple's about to go on. Just want to show the detail on this. So first thing to notice about it is this bracket here. Kind of can see that underneath here. So just these 3 buttons just replace the left hand switch pod. So on the stock bike you've got up, down, and select for your power modes, quick shifter, injection control modes. So and they also actually scroll the meter too, depending on how you're using them. So I just put those in here, made a little hockey stick looking bracket, bolted where the factory steering dampener went on the old models. And then the next bracket on here is obviously for the solo lap timer, or not obvious. Obvious if you've got one of those, you recognize that. For the solo lap timer, just this triangle bolts to the lap timer mount, and then a single bolt through where the ignition key used to go, and just a plate on the back gives it something tight to bolt to. And then on the inside, you probably maybe can see sandwiched in there, I just have some brass spacers so that, you know, this doesn't get torqued indefinitely and start to bow and bend. There's some spacers in there, so there's a positive stop for this nut to torque up against. So go ahead and slap this on. And then last will be the start-stop switch. And that'll hang out there on the bar, which we will do with suspension and everything. Just throw this cap on, but not tighten it down yet.